Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Empty Man. So, I would honestly feel like Empty, does at some point compare this movie. Man, this movie, seemed at the very beginning, it did have a lot of potential. It kind of goes into, Slender Man kind of territory. But then eventually they try to over explain the whole empty man of thing. And eventually the more that they try to keep putting this thing together, and the more that James tries to investigate this whole empty man thing and eventually tries to put the pieces of this puzzle together, just leads him in much more confusion. And I'm assuming the viewer probably leads to confusion as well. uh Going through this film, I was watching this not feeling scared whatsoever. So immediately if someone is like, well, I'm kind of interested in this film anyways, but is it like a scary film? Not whatsoever. A lot of times there might be some gruesome kills or stuff that might make people uncomfortable, but it's not scary at all. Really, there's just points in time when we just have our character who stumbles upon something, and then I'm just like, okay, so they went into no real explanation of that in the film, or they just decided why bother. Uh, I would have liked take the time to actually fully explain something in a movie, and I don't care that give it a perspective thing of just okay, so I get James wasn't there, but do it from the person that had probably died during that scenario. Don't give me a death after the fact. That just kind of sucks, because then I'm just I'm kind of it's gonna bother me in my head to where it's just okay, did this person decide to do this, or did the empty man decide push these people to do this? What was the connection here? uh but yeah, so going into this movie, they try to they first try to explain this thing and to give you kind of those creepy vibes of The Grudge, where The Grudge would consistently go through that kind of thing, and have this kind of gargly whatever thing that eventually everyone starts going into. um I would say the beginning of this has potential, but if you watch this whole entire movie, bravo to you. I watched the whole entire thing, and I was just like, man, I don't know how I can just I felt like I wasted 2 hours. Just because I was just like, man, if I could have gone into a Slender Man movie, or if I could have gone into the Bye Bye Man, or if I could have gone into something else like this, I would have felt better going out of it, compared to this movie. And so for anybody who likes movies like The Bye Bye Man or The Slender Man, definitely I would love to go and re-review The Bye Bye Man, because I actually thought that that movie was fun. I actually liked it. Uh, this just has a bizarrish I don't know how these people got the story of the empty man, but eventually the story just gets out, and I guess it takes a number of years for this story to actually get out. But once it does, then it just everybody just has to bizarrely go to a bridge, whistle in a bottle, and I guess maybe say the empty man a once or twice, and then just call it a day, because eventually uh it kind of has that videotaping thing where eventually after 3 days after you do this, the empty man will supposedly come for you. So it's kind of like The Ring, where if you watch the videotape and then 7 days, the ring person is going to come after you and kill you. And I'm just like, well, wait a minute. But why is it all of a sudden they also have these people that are praying to the empty man, that are basically trying to philosophize, or whatever you want to say it, the whole empty man of thing, how we have a bunch of people that are all of a sudden uh loving the word of the empty man. And so we have this whole congregation or whatever with this preacher who is to be Arthur Parsons, who is to explain the fundamentals of the empty man to people. And I'm just like, what? And then all of a sudden, like, but we still have, like, this guy who, like, eventually someone has to tell us that James is a detective. Because, man, what a clear-cut backstory we have of James. It's just like, oh, yeah, you're a detective, right? That's about a bulk of, like, backstory that we're going to get of this person. And then James consistently has to tell us, oh, yeah, hey, man, I'm from San Francisco. Like, we hear that twice throughout this movie. Like, hey, man, like, I shouldn't have to take this crap because I'm from San Francisco. Like, who cares? Who cares where you're from? Like, I think at first, I think he said, like, St. Louis, like I thought, and then, like, he ends up saying, like, San Francisco. But yeah, like, James, like, it doesn't really seem like he has a backstory, but it seems that eventually you find out that both James and Nora has had a history together, and, like, eventually we'll trickle that out, where it seems like there's a lot more history than both Nora and James will admit to these detectives at the very beginning of this movie. But yeah, like, eventually it just gets to the point where, bizarrely, like, the empty man eventually needs a vessel in this movie that he needs, like, a person to become into. Because that just makes sense. This thing is just going around, just killing people. And you would have thought that maybe he would have just decided, you know what? Like, I just want to, like, instead of killing everyone, how about I just become these people? But no, like, this empty man has to kill all these people. You would have thought that that would have been a better approach, to have empty man become someone and then go after the other person, or, like, you know, just would have been some kind of, like, sound like thing. But yeah, so, but I've kind of been talking for far too long about this movie, and it probably doesn't deserve this kind of time being used up. So I think it's about that time to go into that double 5 time territory, because I think it's just about that time to go into spoiler time. So let's go into it. Spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time we do spoil this movie. So at first we have these, like, I guess I would call them, like, rock climbers, or, like, just explorers, adventurers during, like, the worst part of weather. Because, like, it's winter time during the place where they're, like, exploring. And so I'm like, why would you pick during this time to just, like, I guess maybe if they're just backpackers anyways, and they're just people that just do this, like, year round, then I guess maybe they're just forced to, like, eventually go through all of the elements of weather and what have you. But anyways, so all of a sudden we have these people, like, going through this, like, rocky-ish, like, environment. All of a sudden we have one character, and I'm not going to go through the names at the beginning of these characters. You're probably going to tell, like, throughout this review that I'm just not going to go into specifics about everyone's name, but, like, probably the more key important people. Just because, like, I would be going and checking through a number of X amount of minutes to find every one of these people's names. So one guy is to fall through this hole of this cave slash mountain of a place. And so we eventually have one guy who is to go and, like, kind of climb down to get to this man. And so all of a sudden we just see this one man who is kind of Indian style, like, kind of sitting, and he is just looking at the statue like a zombie. And so we have this one man who is just kind of looking at this skeleton piece as well, and he's like, wow, this looks interesting. And so we all of a sudden just have the guy that came to try to rescue his friend, like, he's asking his friend, it's like, hey man, are you hurt? Like, what's up? Like, what's going on? Like, did something just snap in you? Like, what's going on here, buddy? And so, like, his friend is telling him, don't touch me or you'll die. And so he's just like, what are you talking about? Like, so, like, he is so confused. He's just like this guy evidently had some, like, maybe he hit his head during the way down and maybe he just, like, maybe his screw was loose. I don't know. So we have this guy going and just grabbing his friend and kind of chucking him over his, like, shoulder, so to speak. He's like carrying him out like fireman style, like over his body. And so, like, he's just picking up his friend and, like, bringing his friend back out to all the other friends. So they decide that they're all gonna go and, like, they luckily found this, like, cabin that's nearby, and so they all head into this home. And so it seems like the girls are mentioning that this guy is to eventually start to get sick. And so the one guy who's completely fine is just like, well, I think we're about like 5 miles out of, like, the nearest, like, help service kind of a thing. So, like, if anything, like, if worse comes to worse, like, maybe I'll just go out there and we'll eventually like make our way to uh like finding where we can, like, stay safe and also get this guy help. Because there's this one part where they're to go through this, like, bridge that seems really flimsy, and eventually they make their way back through that bridge. And so, like, eventually they're on this bridge, and so we have, like, the one guy who's just kind of like, yeah, look how sturdy this bridge is. And so everybody else is just like, yeah, I don't know, it just kind of seems just like, yeah, like they're gonna fall or whatever. But, like, that happens before, like, eventually the one guy goes crazy. So what eventually just ends up happening is we have the group go back onto where the bridge is. Eventually they make it across, and eventually we just have the one loony guy who ends up taking this one thing that looks kind of like a top half of a bottle, and he just keeps blowing into it. And so what eventually ends up happening is people are just like, man, like, we need to keep going. But all of a sudden we just have where, because one of the females of the group is also starting to lose her mind slowly but surely. And, like, she starts thinking that she's seeing things, because what ends up happening is she ends up, like, hearing a knocking, and, like, so she opens this door and thinks or sees an empty man, like, but she's not quite sure, so she goes out there, and all of a sudden, like, she realizes that it's not her friends, and so she runs back into the cabin and locks the door. And then eventually, like, her friends just start knocking on the door, and so she opens it and lets her friends in, because this girl is starting to just slowly but surely lose her mind. So eventually, once we get to the bridge, all of a sudden this girl is to eventually have a knife on her. And eventually, one by one, these friends all of a sudden start falling off this bridge, like off the side of it, to basically just be dead forever. Because we have either the girl kind of cutting all of her friends up, or eventually they just fall, they just decide to fall through this bridge on themselves. And so I'm just like, okay, this doesn't make sense. Whatever with this movie, but, like, I hope that they explain it. But you would hope so. Like, everything that ended up happening, but we end up finding out the one guy who ended up doing a little blowy on this bridge. We end up finding out that this guy ended up going into a hospital and ended up just kind of staying in this hospital, I guess, comatose. And so, like, the people who, I guess, are empty man believers, like, brought this guy here, and, like, eventually just had him, like, sitting there as like the vessel or whatever, because it seems like he's like an antenna like connection between all the other people that believe in Empty Man. And it seems like at some point like this guy could speak to them. And so this all of a sudden transitions us to 2018 with James Lasombra, who is a supposed previous detective. We're just having to believe that from what people are to say. Like, we can't really confirm or deny anything. So what eventually ends up happening is James is to eventually get to be attached to this whole Empty Man thing, because eventually we have a girl named Amanda who decides with her friends to go on this bridge and decides to blow into this bottle and to call upon the Empty Man. And so all of a sudden, James is to eventually go to Nora's home because Amanda has gone missing. And there all of a sudden is to be a mirror that says, "The Empty Man made me do it." So eventually, like, real actual detectives are being called, and so that's when one of the other detectives like mentioned to James, "Hey, you used to be a detective, right?" And James was like, "Yeah." Like, but like, I guess that really helps us with backstory. Thanks a lot, movie. So anyways, so we eventually find out further on in this movie that it seems that both James and Nora did have an affair with one another and did sleep with one another. And because what ends up happening is, I guess, Nora had suffered a loss with her husband dying, and so James was kind of there to comfort her. And I guess that led to them kind of just, SEXing it out. So, but eventually, like, James and Nora hasn't told Amanda that. So, but anyways, James goes on to eventually like figure out, because like James goes to Amanda's school and starts asking her friends about what had happened, because coincidentally, I guess, like, James can just easily find all of this girl's friends and start asking her about the situation, asking like uh, Amanda's friends about the situation. And so eventually James is to go to this bridge and eventually just blow on this bottle as well, and then just chuck the bottle. And so eventually James is starting to just go all the way through this bridge to just kind of check this bridge out. And so all of a sudden he is to eventually go down this one part of this bridge where it leads down this ladder to eventually find a bunch of people who all hung themselves, and has this sign that says, "The Empty Man made me do it." Also, James mentions to Nora that I guess the police officers were wondering if this girl had any pets, because more than likely it probably seems like the blood that was on the mirror probably wasn't human. So, but yeah, so the detectives all are to find this whole bridge thing, because it seems like they honestly just aren't as good as James is at this job. And so it's like, hey, good for you, James, that you found out all about this stuff within one whole day, compared to, like, what were the detectives doing? Were they just going to naturally assume, oh, I guess his case is just going to go cold? And, like, meh, like, because it doesn't really seem like they were going to, like, I don't know, maybe it was just like they were like not quite, like they were maybe hoping that this girl would come to them. I don't know, like, I don't know what exactly they were doing. Where James could easily figure stuff out a lot quicker than these guys could. But probably there's a lot more cases than just this one, so it's just like, meh, like, we have a lot more pressing matters than this. So, uh, so eventually James is to eventually start finding out about this whole like seemingly like occult or seemingly people who all believe about this empty man thing, which kind of leads us to eventually having James going to this one seminar where James is kind of asking this girl, like, how long have they been, like, doing this whole, like, seminar of a thing talking about Empty Man? And supposedly they've been doing this since 2013. And so it's like, okay. So James goes on to, like, hear this, like, babbling about this man talking about, like, the Empty Man and, the philosophy of it and, like, the belief of it. And it feels like a sermon or whatever. So all of a sudden, James is to tie himself onto this one guy, um, who I believe is Garrett, who, like, James is starting to ask him questions about this, and it seems like Garrett is starting to have, uh, like, answers for James to start looking into. And so James eventually goes and starts finding files and stuff about these cases, and eventually leads him to eventually finding, like, as people are to still die off from the Empty Man, because I guess every third day after these people blow on these bottles, eventually all these people are going to die. Like, we start to see some people dying, some people get, like, scissors in their freaking eye, and they end up dying that way. So there is, every once in a while, a random death via this Empty Man, but it rarely happens, seemingly, in this movie after some point. That just kind of stops, and it just becomes like, how creepy can this movie be? Because eventually, once James continues to do some more investigation about this occult, or about this, about people that are tied to this occult, or whatever, he starts continuing to find files of people everywhere. Eventually, it just gets to the point where he is to go into one, kind of one place where all of a sudden there's this huge group of, like, people who are all to be, like, these cult followers on these, like, black hoodies that are all, like, praying for the Empty Man. And so James stumbles upon this, and so all of a sudden, like, James is just watching these people perform, like, this whole, like, cult, like, connectional thing together. And so James is to watch on as these people are doing this, and all of a sudden, like, the light goes out, and then James is like, oh crap. So James starts backing away, and then all of a sudden we have this entire group that knows James is there, and all of a sudden this whole entire group moves as one. When James takes 2 steps back, the whole entire group takes 2 steps forward. And so he's like, F this. And so James starts running off back to his car, and we have this entire group just swarming on top of James's car and just trying to get at him. And so James starts, like, backing up like crazy, and, like, he tries to get away from this group. It just makes him, like, forcibly just want to protect Nora, because, like, Nora has come to James' apartment and given him, like, Chinese food, and, like, it seems like she just really right now needs somebody to comfort her, to where she's, like, grabbing onto James's hand, and, like, it seems like Nora is just wanting to just be with somebody right now. And that leads to eventually James, when like, James takes Nora and it's like, okay, we need to get out of here. We need to go to a hotel or something, like, because, like, we want, like, we should be able to, like, feel like we're, like, that we don't have to, like, be scared of anything right now, and I think we are. Or really James is. So, because what ends up happening is James ends up getting this, like, mangled up teddy bear, like, in front of his house. And so James just takes his teddy bear and he has the head of it, and he's just like, hey, like, I'm taking this, like, like, What are you gonna do? What's the teddy bear? And so, like, James just bizarrely has his teddy bear in the backseat of his car, and it's just like, what is this, like a nanny camp? What is this thing? So, but yeah, so we eventually have both James and Nora at this hotel. And so that's when James finally confronts Nora and asks, like, hey, does, like, your daughter know about us? Like, how, like, we were, like, together once? And, like, eventually they actually showcase that after Nora's husband's funeral, eventually they, like, got together and were just banging it out. So like we but yeah, so Nora's like, yeah, I don't think our like I don't think that Amanda knows about this. Like, I assumed or thought that Nora was to be dead at this point, but I guess I was completely wrong about this movie because it seems like there was a number of like dead bodies that were hung under this bridge, and I thought that Amanda, or like that Nora's daughter, was one of them, but I guess I was wrong. So eventually this all leads to James going to this coma patient, and because what eventually ends up happening is James is to find more files, and he ends up finding a file about this coma patient, and this all of a sudden is to lead to pictures of James, who seemingly was, I guess, just born in this whole occult thing. That really, like, this guy just magically, deliciously just has some past that I guess everyone just made up at some point. Because eventually James is to go to this coma patient, and Amanda is to be there. And it seems like Amanda is shaving this guy, the guy I guess who was in the cave, who was the only surviving member left, who was whistling Sweet Dixie into this bottle. And so Amanda is talking to James, and like Amanda is basically just explaining to James that the empty man eventually needs like a vessel to go into, and James, you're going to be it. Because if anything, like James like was just created for this whole thing, and James doesn't really have a real true backstory. Like really, like Amanda is asked like, "Hey, what high school did you go to? Like, like, like what? Like where did you live before this? Like where? Like she like you would like think she just asked one question. Do you would think that she would like ask like a million of them? Just like, what's your favorite color? Like what's your favorite food? Ba 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 ba. Like, what's your earliest memory? Like, because this guy has nothing. This guy is a clean slate because this guy was just built to be a vessel for the empty man. He just popped out of somewhere one day. And so yeah, the the empty man, so we just have James, who's bizarrely like in some like darkened tunnel where he's just kind of like walking around, and that is just to lead him to go and have the empty man go inside James. And so all of a sudden after that, we just have James, who ends up killing the previous coma patient. And so James walks out of the hospital room, and every single person that is all in the hospital evidently is like disciples of this empty man. And so they just bow down to James, and they're like, yeah, like finally, like the chosen one has become the empty man or whatever. So what does any of this mean? I don't frickin' know. If people want a heavy explanation of this movie, you came to the wrong person. Uh, like I know there's probably a lot more in-depth people that like know about all kinds of things and whatever. And I know there's going to be someone here that is going to overly explain this whole thing to me, because more than likely they probably reviewed this and are now just like, well, yeah, like I'm gonna go and like since I reviewed this also, like I'm going to go into mention this to this reviewer because I have insight or whatever. Or maybe I just looked at some article and copied and pasted because there's people that do that too. Um, but yeah, like so. But I don't mind those people. Like I can like I just like to review certain things certain ways, and I also don't mind like certain people who I guess want to like just be able to just kind of like mention their thoughts about a movie or whichever. Because they have every right to do that. They have their opinions, and that's perfectly fine. Like I don't want to just feel like I'm trying to like badmouth anybody. Um, but I also am just like, okay, like I'm probably not going to want to know the whole mythos of the Empty Man just because I just don't think I have any interest past this point of this movie, which is me just watching this now. So yeah. So with that said, like there might have been a whole comic book following of this thing, and maybe they're like, yeah, the comic books were definitely better. Um, but yeah. So with that said, I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.